In the west of Europe, the fall of the Western Roman Empire ushered in the early Middle Ages. It was a time when victorious Germanic successor kingdoms converted to Catholicism and consolidated politically, with the Franks and Gaul emerging as the most powerful new kingdom in Western Europe. Frankish rulers faced new threats as Muslim raiders crossed the Pyrenees and pillaged France. One such Muslim expeditionary force was soundly defeated in 732 at Tours by Charles Martel, a royal official who had a reputation as a fierce military campaigner. The Battle of Tours was also a great political victory for Charles, securing his position as the most powerful man in France. He would face other Muslim raiders in southern France, and a persistent Islamic presence north of the Pyrenees would not be vanquished until his son Pepin III pushed the Muslims from Septimania in 759. The grandson of Charles Martel, Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, built on the accomplishments of his father and grandfather. During his 46-year reign between 768 and 814, Charlemagne undertook an unprecedented 54 military campaigns, greatly expanding the territory of the Frankish kingdom. And even though the Frankish army was relatively small compared to the armies of the classical period, modern estimates of its size vary from 5,000 to 35,000 fighting men. It was sufficient to carve out the largest state Western Europe had seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire some 300 years earlier. His impressive military and political achievements led him to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the papacy in Rome on Christmas Day 800. Charlemagne's campaigns took him to many areas of Europe. In 773 he led his army into Italy, crushing the Lombards and crowning his son King of Italy. 4 years later, Charlemagne crossed the Pyrenees into northern Spain. Although this campaign proved disappointing, in 778, Charlemagne and his successors were successful in eventually establishing the Spanish March. This area was a string of fortifications in Catalonia, which served as a defensive bulwark against Muslim raiding and a future base of operations for the Christian reconquest of Spain in the 11th century. Charlemagne was more successful in his eastern campaigns in Germany. In 787 he invaded Bavaria and brought the region under his rule. In 790 his Frankish armies marched east along the Danube and utterly destroyed the Avar Empire in the Balkans, seizing their wealth accumulated in 2 centuries of raiding and adding it to his own territory. Perhaps Charlemagne's greatest success came in Frisia and Saxony, a region in northern Germany between the Rhine and Elbe rivers. Beginning in 772, Charlemagne set his sights on the conquest and conversion of these regions, but resistance was fierce. He campaigned numerous times in Saxony from 772 to 803. It was not until 804, after 18 annual campaigns, that Saxony was finally pacified and added to the Carolingian domain. Charlemagne never developed a regular standing army. Instead, he relied on feudal levies to raise his forces. It did not take the emperor long to assimilate new regions into his military machine. Just 2 years after bringing Saxony into the kingdom, Charlemagne created a sliding scale of military contributions, ordering 5 Saxon vassals to equip a 6th to campaign in Spain, and 2 to equip a 3rd for Bohemia, while all of them were required to campaign against regional threats. In 807, he issued a capitulary stating all nobles in the realm holding a benefice were now obligated to undertake military service. If a noble failed to muster for war, he risked the confiscation of his estate. Charlemagne perfected this system to the point where he could raise several annual levies and conduct operations on multiple fronts, including Germany, Bohemia, Brittany, and Spain. The composition and equipment of Charlemagne's army was also continuously evolving. Initially, the Carolingian army was comprised mostly of infantry, but as campaigning took him further and further from his base in Austrasia, Charlemagne soon relied increasingly on mounted troops over infantry. His numerous capitularies point to the raised status of cavalry. Between 792 and 793, he issued regulations requiring vassals to have a horse, shield, lance, sword, dagger, bow, quiver, and arrows. In other royal decrees, wealthier nobles were ordered to come to war wearing mail and were asked to bring rations for 3 months of service and clothing for 6. Furthermore, these greater magnates were to make certain their own vassals came on campaign with a standardized panoply consisting of shield, spear, bow, and 12 arrows. Even attendants were required to be armed with bows. Charlemagne's military success was not founded on the decisive engagement. It was instead based on a well-trained and experienced feudal fighting force wearing down the enemy through a strategy of attrition, and the ability to raise several armies for annual campaigns in different regions. He also recognized the impending threat to his empire, building and garrisoning forts along his borders with the Muslims, Danes, and Slavs. Charlemagne even took extreme measures to try to maintain his superiority in military equipment. He threatened the forfeiture of all property to anyone selling male hauberks to foreigners, and death to anyone who exported Carolingian swords out of the country. Perhaps Charlemagne's greatest military legacy was his emphasis on cavalry as an instrument of strategic mobility. And though the stirrup-stabilized lancer, probably present in limited numbers during Charlemagne's reign, did not revolutionize battle tactics in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, heavy cavalry's importance as the centerpiece of the Carolingian tactical system was a harbinger of things to come. Several events in the 9th and 10th centuries elevated this position of the shock cavalry on the battlefields of Western Europe and led to their dominance in medieval warfare. Also, the characteristics of Charlemagne himself were part of what made him such a renowned leader. He towered over his contemporaries both figuratively and literally. He was an imposing figure, 6 foot 3.5 inches tall, thick-necked and large-framed. He could be warm and talkative, but he could also be hard, cruel, and violent, and his subjects came to regard him with both admiration and fear. Charlemagne was a warrior king above all else. He developed a notion of Christian mission in a program of unifying and systematically expanding the Christian West. He ruled his empire for 14 years until his death from natural causes in 814. His force and dynamic personality were needed to create the empire, and without him, disintegrating elements quickly took hold. These separate kingdoms of Charlemagne's empire would eventually form the modern nations of Western Europe,